What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So I need you guys to do me a favor, all right? I don't usually ask this, but this is one of those videos that I need to get out. I need this video to get out to certain people who can actually, influence, you know, the situation. Those of you who are Laker fans, number one, those of you who are Laker fans and you're on websites and um, put this video or put links to this video out there. Okay. Those of you who follow anybody on Twitter or Facebook that's affiliated with the Lakers, former players or former personnel or current players, you know, hell, even Jenny Buss, LeBron, I don't know, forward this video, okay? Because they have the power to actually make this happen, okay? And the reason why I thought about doing about this video is because James Harden, as I reported yesterday, he's going to have his jersey retired by the Houston Rockets. I don't have a problem with that. James Harden's done enough to have his jersey retired. But then it got me thinking, why on earth haven't the Los Angeles Lakers retired George Mikan's jersey? And a lot of people don't know that. They don't know that the Lakers have never retired his jersey. Now let me tell you the players that have had their jersey numbers retired. Okay. Of course, Kobe Bryant. The late great Kobe Bryant has had both of his jerseys retired, number 8 and number 24. Shaquille O'Neal, okay, his number 34. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's number 33. Magic Johnson's number 32. Wilt Chamberlain's number 13. Jerry West's number 44. These are no-brainers. Elgin Baylor's number 22. James Worthy's number 42. Gail Goodridge's number 25. And I believe the last one is Jamal Wilkes, number 52, as far as players are concerned. I don't have any issues with any one of these guys having their jerseys numbers retired, but I think most of us would agree that when it comes to Goodrich, Worthy, and Wilkes, at least, Mikan is ahead of them in the pecking order. But he's never had his jersey number retired. Now, I don't know whether or not it's the fact that ever since Los Angeles has been Los Angeles, they don't seem to want to acknowledge their Minnesotan roots. I don't know if it's something to do with that, but that would explain why the goddamn team is named Lakers, because there aren't any fucking lakes like that in Los Angeles. All right, but there's a lot of them in Minnesota. But this is the thing: George Mikan was the NBA's first true superstar. Now, Joe Fulks was a star with the Golden State, well, at the time, the Philadelphia Warriors, excuse me. But it was Mikan that was the first star. When the Minneapolis Lakers used to play against a team back then, whether it was the Rochester Royals or the Toronto Huskies or the New York Knickerbockers or the Boston Celtics or the Fort Wayne Pistons or the Chicago Stags, it wouldn't say Minneapolis Lakers, it would say George Mikan. Okay? It would say George Mikan versus this team. He was possibly the most dominant athlete in sports at that time because Joe Louis had retired. All right? Remember, he's one of only, I believe, 4 players to have won a championship while also leading the NBA in scoring. Of course, Michael Jordan. Shaq did it in 2000, Kareem in 1971. George Mikan did it twice. One of those years, George Mikan averaged 28.3 points per game. which blew away at the time any other person's personal scoring record. Now remember, this was when the NBA was at a slower pace, and the Lakers led the NBA, or it still might have been the NBL at that time. Can't remember, but he led the league. The Lakers led the league with 84 points per game. Now, to put that into perspective for today, that would be like LeBron averaging 37.5 points per game right now for the Lakers, or Bradley Beal averaging an absurd 39 points a game right now. 39 points a game. That's the offensive impact that Big George Mikan had. Now, George Mikan, of course, so instrumental, the Mikan drill, which, you know, basically consisted of, you know, basically consists of, what's the word I'm looking for? Repetitive, basic offensive drills, layups, and left hand, right hand, hook shots, and things of that nature. That comes from George Mikan, George freaking Mikan. Um, he was the first guy really to utilize the jump hook. Okay, everybody else has perfected it, but it came from George Mikan. Another thing about George Mikan is this: George Mikan changed the way that the game was played. I mean, and the way that franchises built championship teams. It was him. Uh, Before him, as crazy as it sounds, the prevailing notion was that big people would not make good basketball players. The prevailing notion was that they were clumsy, uncoordinated, um, slow. It just wouldn't fit, you know. That's why we look at a lot of those old teams. I'm not talking 1940s, 50s. I'm talking about we look at a picture of, guys that look like they had a pound of Brill cream in their hair, right? From the 30s and 20s and shit. Up for a game of basketball, Jasper? Well, suddenly, dun 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 dun. But you notice all those guys, dun 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 dun. After the game, let's go to a speakeasy. Dun, dun. All those dudes, they're like 5'11", 5'10". But it was George Mikan's coach, whose name I believe was Ray Myers, high school coach, and went on to coach him in DePaul. He's the one that had the idea that a big man could dominate basketball. He was right. Now, George Mikan was not a natural athlete. He had to work with George Mikan. He had to work on his coordination, exercise, dancing. He had him chasing chickens, that shit that they stole from them and put in the Rocky movie. He had George Mikan doing shit like that. Um, Anything to increase his speed, his stamina, and his confidence too. That's another aspect of it. He told him that he would be great, and he did all these different things, and ultimately, and also worked on his muscle memory with the Mikan drill, which became a standard thing for kids, playing uh, JV, varsity, junior varsity, and up. But anyway, George Mikan was so dominant in college in the fall, he won the equivalency of an NCAA title, I think, in 1945. Around that time, they instituted goaltending because they didn't think it was humanly possible for anybody to be able to block a shot that easily. I mean, he was blocking everything because he was 6'10", 240, 45 pounds. Everybody else was probably under 6'8". Okay, George Michael gets to the pros, and eventually he plays for the Minneapolis Lakers. And he and Vern Mickelson and Jim Pollard and Slater Martin uh, later on began a dynasty where I believe they won back-to-back titles, only be interrupted in 1951 by the Rochester Royals. But then they went on to win three more titles, and they were the first team to win three consecutive NBA championships. And only a handful of teams have done that. The Michael Lakers, Shaq and Kobe Lakers, the Bulls, of course, and the Russells Sixers, Celtics, excuse me. But George Michael, for his career, averaged 23 points and 14 rebounds. They didn't count blocks, but he probably led the NBA in blocks every year. Um, he probably would be somewhere around top five, top six all time in blocks if they were counted. And he played the game when it was more it was a different brand of basketball. It was probably the toughest era. There were no pushover cupcake fouls back then. Um, they had uh, you could literally do something called mauling back then, which was a very, very aggressive, hard foul on a person. Okay, throw you to the fucking ground. It was a different type of basketball. It was almost like football in a lot of ways. Very physical. Guys got their teeth knocked out at times. Guys had black eyes. Guys sometimes even had broken bones playing defense back then, or going up against guys defensively. Um, Guys could clothesline you with fast break. Guys would elbow you in the throat. It was a different fucking type of basketball. That's what I'm trying to convey here. It may not have been the most skilled basketball, don't make no mistake about it, but these guys were tough, right? And another thing I want to say is this. It was George Mikan that kept the Lakers afloat. And I forgot to mention this in a video I did earlier, so I'm re-recording this. It was George Mikan that kept the NBA afloat because after he retired for good, I think after 56, it might have been, um, the Lakers went through a couple of years of obscurity and they lost a lot of money when George Mikan retired. And if it wasn't for the Lakers signing Elgin Baylor, they would have folded. They would have folded. So that goes to show you how much George Mikan meant to that franchise. And then also they changed the rules for him. Okay, um, the combination of George Mikan and the high school prospects of Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain uh, led to the NBA implementing goaltending as well to try to take away from the dominance of those incoming guys plus George Mikan. Um, the biggest rule change they probably made, the two biggest ones, are the institution of the shot clock in 1954-55. I think this was done for a couple of reasons. Basketball was getting ugly, okay? Basketball was even more of a bogged down half court affair than it was in the late 90s, okay? And the Lakers could just simply play keep away all night. They didn't. They had the ball in their possession for as long as they want to. There was no 24-second shot clock, and sometimes the games were ugly. Final score 37, 35, including the infamous 1918 victory that the Minneapolis Lakers had against the Fort Wayne Pistons. No more of that after 54, 55. You had 24 seconds to shoot the goddamn ball. But this also sped the game up, and that was a little bit of a detriment to a guy like George Mikan, who was a lumbering center, 6'10", by that time 270 pounds. So he did not fare as well in this style of basketball, and his minutes were reduced. He was already getting older anyway. By that time he was 31, but in those days, the way the game was played, he was physically more like 37, 38. Just an old player overnight. And then also, of course, because George Mikan, they widened the lanes from 6 feet to 12 feet in an attempt to lessen his dominance. And it worked to an extent. You know, he went from being a guy averaging 27, 28 to being a guy averaging more like 22, 23. But they still were winning, you know. And later on, of course, George Mikan went on to become the first commissioner of the ABA. And it was his idea to come up with the red, white, and blue ball. All right? And to a latter part of his career, a latter part of his life, George Mikan and a group of investors talked the NBA into bringing basketball back to Minnesota. Hence why in 1980, was it 89? I think it was 89. Hence why in 1989, the Minnesota Timberwolves were brought to Minnesota. And later on, of course, this is a franchise that featured several great players, but the greatest, of course, being Kevin Garnett, who is probably the greatest player to play in that franchise history, even though the owner and him, uh, the current owner and him, don't get along. But George Mikan, his number should definitely be retired, man. Um, I have no idea why it's not. The Lakers won 17 championships, right? Tied with the Boston Celtics. But they count all 17 titles, right? They don't just count the 12 after the Mikan era. They count all 17. So if you're going to include the championships, you should include and honor the contributions of George Mikan. George Mikan, unfortunately, because of the NBA's callous uh, policy where their pension and medical benefits were shut off to players who played before 1965. George Mikan retired in the mid-50s. George Mikan did not have access to these things, and ultimately, you know, he died a poor man. Made no sense. He died relatively poor. He was in a wheelchair. He suffered from diabetes and other ailments. I think he had a leg amputated. If I remember correctly, he died just before, I think he died just before the beginning of the 2005 NBA Finals, if I'm not mistaken. And Shaquille O'Neal paid for his funeral. So I think it's time that the Lakers honor Big George Mikan and retire his number 9. It should have happened during his lifetime, but here we are 15 years after his passing, more than 15 years after his passing, and they still haven't retired his number. And it's